is that I ask you all, unless you're speaking, to mute your microphone. That way, if anything's happening in the background, we won't necessarily get to hear it. And then how we will proceed today is our moderator will be Phil Soergel. I will introduce him. We will have a short presentation from Umberto, and then a discussion by Lucio Biasiori. Is that a good pronunciation?
Perfect.
Yes, good. And then we will turn to the question and answer. And for that, we ask you to, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm not quite sure how you do that. Rachel, do you know? Can you help us there?
I'm not certain. I know there are reactions there, but that's not hand raising.
Yeah, well, let's use the thumbs up as a raised hand.
Karen, you can raise the hand in the participants thing, although I don't see it. Normally at the bottom it says participants, and if you click on that, there's a hand raising function. But I don't see, this is a weird presentation. I have never seen one like this because I don't get the view. And I don't know, maybe, oh, there we go. There it is. If you go to participants at the bottom,
yes,
and if you just participants, you should be getting, oh, that's weird. It doesn't
show up. I just raised my hand.
Yes, it does. It says participants. It gives you the names, and then on the bottom there's a raise hand thing, a little icon and the words. And if you click on that, then whoever is host, probably you, will see who's raising his or her hand.
Karen, I just raised my hand and it's showing up. So if you don't see it next to my name, then it's not working.
Who is that speaking there?
I can see.
Claire.
Okay. Rachel, can you?
I don't see the icon for raising your hand.
Okay, let's do this.
You just do this.
Let me suggest that if you want to speak, let's use the thumbs up, which is in the reactions at the bottom right. That way Phil will also be able to see it, and we will monitor that. In addition, if we don't see you for some reason, feel free to just write in the chat and say, I would like to speak. And we will put you in the queue. Okay, so with that, let me introduce our moderator for today, who many of you know. He is professor and chair of the Department of History at the University of Maryland, but he is also the sponsor for Umberto's postdoctoral study at the University of Maryland. Soergel is the author of the 1993 book Wondrous in His Saints, the Counter-Reformation Propaganda in Bavaria, and more recently in 2012, Miracles and the Protestant Reformation. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Phil.
Thank you, Karen. I just want to welcome you today and also give a brief introduction to Umberto Grassi, who's been with us now almost 2 years, but sadly, this last few months hasn't been as rewarding as it might have been, though we've still managed to talk and have exchange despite being shut in. And Umberto, I'm glad to see your apartment there. When you told me it was a basement, I had this like image of a dingy black coal cellar, you know.
No, it's nice. It's nice. A nice place where to isolate.
Umberto came to us. He's a Marie Curie fellow and is affiliated for 2 years with Maryland, and then next year he'll move on to the University of Verona. But before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the ARC Center of Excellence for the History of Emotions. You know, that's affiliated with the University of Western Australia, but he was in the Sydney node for several years. He received the MA at the University of Pisa and then went on to do the PhD under the direction of Adriano Prosperi at the Scuola Normale. And his PhD thesis was awarded a prize in a LGBTQ studies contest. It was published in 2014. In 2012, Grassi joined the FIRB project Beyond the Holy War that focused on interactions between Christians and Muslims in the early modern period. And he was a research fellow based at the Scuola Normale. He's published several articles and co-edited volumes and has authored 2 monographs. I kept trying to practice my Duolingo Italian, but I don't want to embarrass myself publicly. In English, their titles would be the Offitio sopra l'onesta, the Control of Sodomy in 16th Century Lucca, which is currently under review for an English translation in Toronto, I believe, isn't it? And Sodom, Prosecution, Affects, Social Practices, 5th to 18th centuries. He's also edited a critical edition of Daniele Bartoli's Asia for the Italian publisher Einaudi. So let me introduce, he's going to give us a short sort of précis of his paper, followed by Lucio Biasiori's comment.
So thank you very much for your presentation. And I mean, I want to thank, sorry, I got problems with the, okay, there we are. I want to thank Karin for giving me the opportunity to be here. I mean, we organized this way before the outbreak of the pandemic. So it was before this unprecedented and scary time. And then, I mean, most of the events that were, already planned that were going on in the department, they've just been like canceled. But I said after a while that I was practicing social distancing, I started to kind of miss some company. And also, I see that actually this kind of Zoom new like online environment was working. And so I asked Karin if she was willing to host anyway the event. And for me, it was really important because I spent like the first year here doing research, mostly doing like secondary research at the Library of Congress and the Folger Library. And I organized like a series of events that they were all planned for the second semester and they're all gone. So for me, it was really important to have at least one, to keep at least one chance to have kind of discussion with all of you. All the colleagues that have been like with me in the last 2 years. And this is also a chance for me to like say hello to everyone because I'll be leaving relatively soon. Also, I anticipated a bit my leave, so I'll be leaving at the end of July. And I wanted just to express like my gratitude to all of you. I found a very like welcoming environment. I've always felt home since the beginning. That's not the first time that I've been that I've moved to other countries. And I have to say that it wasn't the same before. So it was really important for me having this chance. And then there are also some like acknowledgements. I'm here, as a Marie Curie scholar. So the Marie Curie is like a fellowship funded by the Horizon 2020 program from the European Union. And it's meant to be like 2 years outside the European Union and then 1 year back. It's supervised by the University of Verona and as like the Department of History of the University of Maryland as the host institution, host institution abroad. Here, there's also my supervisor, my supervisor in Italy of the project, like Lorenzo Bernini. So it would be nice just to have a chance to introduce Philip and Lorenzo so the 2 supervisors can just maybe wave hello to each other. I don't know if you can see here, okay. And I also want to acknowledge that here, the PhD School of Arts and Humanities decided to endorse this event. So there are also some PhD students who have joined us, and that's a real, great pleasure for me. Then, as Phil has already told you, I will just give a brief summary, kind of an abridged version of the paper that I circulated, so we can skip to like Lucio's comments and then the discussion afterwards. So marvel of the technique, because I don't have like a printer, so that's the only way for me now to read while I'm online. Yeah. So this paper will focus on a series of inquisitorial cases in the Italian peninsula that were prosecuted between the 16th and 18th centuries. The defendants celebrated sexual freedom by referencing a heretical rereading of the myth of the fall from grace. Stating that Adam and Eve practiced anal sex in the terrestrial paradise, they praised the pleasures of unreproductive intercourse, both homo and heterosexual. This idea was associated with the belief that all can be saved in their own faith. That is, that eternal salvation could occur outside the sacramental boundaries of the Catholic Church, and even beyond Christianity, thus including Jews and Muslims. By directly addressing one of the major tenets of the Catholic faith, original sin, these heretics also address two of its main implications: that concupiscence is the major consequence of the fall, and that there was no salvation outside the boundaries of the Church. The skeptic attitudes of these heretics were paired with a harsh criticism of hypocrisy, or the hypocrisy of institutionalized religion, and resulted in a blatant denunciation of their deceptive nature. Although some of the notions expressed by these dissenters can be ascribed to popular forms of disbeliefs that were widely held in the early modern period, they all seem to self-consciously play the role of the dissenter. They boasted about their radicalism, diminishing their neighbors and acquaintances for their naivete and ignorance. They argued with their friends about forbidden books, and some of them reportedly claimed that the Holy Office forbade the books for reasons of state in order to keep people ignorant. The purpose of the paper I circulated for this seminar is to discuss what might have been the learned sources these dissenters were relying upon. In this brief introduction, I will limit myself to point out some of the most relevant hypotheses I am considering in this regard. One of the defendants who was accused, among other charges, of the belief that Adam and Eve committed sodomy in the terrestrial paradise was Ludovico Garrano, tried for heresy and sorcery in Palermo in 1633. The inquisitorial reports retrace the texts allegedly read by Ludovico and his group of friends, which included Girolamo Cardano, De Subtilitate Rerum, Pietro d'Abano, and the Book of Dreams of Artemidorus. Pietro d'Abano and Girolamo Cardano are two names that have been consistently associated to the theory of the imposture of religions. That is, the idea that the founders of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were tricksters who fooled people in order to subjugate them. Pietro d'Abano, 1257-1316, overtly advocated the astrological theory of the cyclical nature of religious eras. According to the horoscope of religion and to the theory of the great conjunctions, historical fates were believed to be subject to a cyclical rhythm that included their origin, development, and decadence. As with other natural phenomena, these cycles were regulated by astral influences. He also suggested a relatively rational approach to miracles, trying to reduce them to natural explanations. Since the Middle Ages, these ideas contributed to undermine the faith in religious revelations and were frequently associated to the development of the theory of the imposture of religion. So they do not overlap. So they're not the same, but they overlap, these two kind of idea of the great conjunctions and the idea of the imposture of religion. Girolamo Cardano, 1501-1576, probably one of the most renowned mathematicians of the 16th century, embraced a wide range of disciplines in his writings. Among other charges, he was prosecuted by the Inquisition for having analyzed the figure of Jesus Christ through his horoscope. Cardano was undoubtedly a source of inspiration for some of the most radical representative of radical libertinism in the 17th century. Marcello Impicciato, yet another defendant accused of stating that the original sin was sodomy, was accused of denying Christ's death on the cross, thus undermining the core tenet of Christian religion. He allegedly repudiated his resurrection. Zotamo Canatta, another defendant here, believed only in the first part of the Christian credo, the one devoted to God the Father, and not in what was written after that. In 1581, it was reported as having said that the Jews had not killed Christ our Lord. Ludovico Garrano sometimes denied the divinity of Jesus. Others, he allegedly argued that someone else had been sacrificed in his place, referring to Simon of Cyrene. One of the hypotheses under consideration is that this statement was influenced by the reading of an Italian translation of the Quran. Zotamo Canatta was kept by Muslim, which is one of the heretics under examination, was kept by Muslim corsairs when he was a teenager and spent a significant part of his juvenile life in Muslim countries, probably in North Africa, where he converted to Islam. After circulating in these informal circles for almost 1 century, the idea that Adam and Eve committed sodomy in the terrestrial paradise emerged in the work of at least 2 major representatives of 17th century radical libertine thought. Le Mot Levaillet, in his Hexameron Rustique, 1671, mentioned the idea that in the terrestrial paradise, the female buttocks were the forbidden fruits, attributing the genesis of this unorthodox belief to previous rabbinic literature. A few years later, in 1678, and then in 1678, no, it's right, sorry, and 1679, one of the most outrageous libertine works ever, Adrian Beverland's De Peccato Originali, came out. Beverland attacked the bigotry of religious sexual morality by presenting his solution to the problem, allowing greater sexual freedom. As Antonio Partenio, one of the dissenters under examination, also stated in his confession, who is allowed to make mistakes errs less. While exaggerating the negative aspects of lust, Beverland actually suggested to the reader to consider the opposite point of view, that sex was a delight, a natural gift to all people. In my core material, the underlying logic of the belief that the forbidden apple symbolized Eve's buttocks and that, therefore, sodomy was the original sin emerged more clearly than elsewhere in a 1662 trial. Fra Giovanni Battista d'Androdoco explicitly affirmed that burglary is an act of beatitude, and that this was the reason why God forbade Adam from eating the apple in the terrestrial paradise, because the apple symbolized buggery, which God wanted to keep to himself. This interpretation can be read as an extreme radicalization of a widely diffused idea in the early modern period that sodomy was a sophisticated practice reserved for the ruling classes. This same notion was expressed in one of the most provocative early modern books written in open praise of sodomy, Antonio Rocco's La Cibia del Fanciullo a Scuola. Rocco defined sodomy as a celestial pleasure, arguing that its ecclesiastical and legal prohibition was only due to the desire of rulers to keep it for themselves. The terrified populace was thus deliberately kept ignorant through religious and legal prescriptions. The theme of deceptions comes back, I think, in a pretty clear way here. Sexual deception in these interpretations was the root itself of political and religious deception. In these cases, sex was in fact the foundation of an alternative morality that implied a strong criticism of abstract moral codes that were instead based on the idea of a reward in the afterlife. So they were questioning the idea of living, following moral rules that were based on other worldly rewards rather than giving relevance and importance and enjoying what is given in the present current stage of our life. So, just to briefly conclude, this heretical opinion, after circulating in a scattered but wide manner in the Italian peninsula, starting from the 16th century, emerged in the culture of the learned elites in France and Holland in the 17th century. This element further proves that skeptic approaches to religion, as well as incredulity and atheism, were not just refined literary products. Instead, they were aspects of a wider culture in which common people, along with members of the cultivated elites, creatively elaborated upon such ideas and contributed to their proliferation. It also points out the extent to which sexual themes, rather than being mere divertissement or manifestations of folk attitudes, were important theoretical tools in a wider critique of religious and political authority and authoritarianism. So that's it by now. So.
Thanks, Umberto. Next, we'll move on to Lucio Biasiori's commentary. Lucio is Associate Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Padua. He graduated in History and Civilization at the University of Pisa and in History and Paleography at the Scuola Normale, where he also earned a PhD in History in 2011. During this time, he also spent, or up until this time, he spent research stays as fellows of the Warburg Institute in London, the Italian Institute for Historical Studies in Naples, and Harvard's Villa Etate in Florence. Among his many publications are, again in English, The Heresy of a Humanist, Celio secondo Curione in 15th Century Europe, which was published by Carocci in 2015, and Machiavelli's Writing Desk, The Prince and Xenophon's Cyropaedia, also from Carocci in 2017. So we'll turn the floor over to Lucio now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Umberto, for the beautiful paper, and thank you, Philip, for the presentation. I just prepared a short PowerPoint. I don't know if I'm able to project it. Maybe if Karen or Rachel sign me in as co-host of the meeting, I would be able to show some slides just in order, to help myself to be clearer and not
proves that Lucio is much better than me.
Not boring.
Do you not have a share screen?
Okay, I should be able now. Okay. You should see the PowerPoint now, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you again. I hope I have something, meaningful and especially helpful to say to you. I didn't actually build any coherent discussion. I just, have some very scattered remarks and especially questions, a lot of questions triggered by the rich picture sketched by Umberto. And I will start from, what I think it's the most important point made by your paper in the very first paragraph that you mentioned also in this recap that you gave us. And I quote, by directly addressing, and sorry about my English, by the way, once and forever, but if anyone doesn't understand what I'm saying.
English is excellent, don't worry.
I don't think so, but anyway, I try to do my best. I quote from the very first paragraph of your paper, Umberto. By directly addressing one of the major tenets of the Christian faith, original sin, these heretics also address two of its main implications, that concupiscence is the major consequence of the fall, and that there was no salvation outside the boundaries of the Catholic Church, their skeptic attitudes were paired with a harsh criticism of the hypocrisy of institutionalized religion and resulted in a blatant denunciation of the deceptive nature of revealed religions. So here we have a sort of triangle here. One angle is the critique of the biblical version of the original sin, which leads to, please Umberto, correct me if I'm mistaken, which leads to the other angle, the claim for tolerance, which in turn leads to the sort of apex, I don't know what's the proper way to call it, of the triangle. So the denunciation of the deceptive nature of revealed religions in the plural. You also say that many, and I quote again from your paper, that many of the core beliefs of the heretics who stated that the original sin was sodomy echo some of the core ideas that have always been attributed to the unknown author or authors of this mysterious and infamous book, namely the Treatise of the Three Impostors that you mentioned as well. What I'd really like you to focus on, probably a little bit more than you did in the paper, which was very short, but discussion allows us to be a little bit more diffused, is precisely this shift from religion in the singular to religions in the plural. Or better, to use the vocabulary of the sources from the lex, legge, lei, loi, law, to the leges, leggi, leyes, loi, laws in the plural anyway. On the use of this term, we have now the precious article by Nathan Ristuccia, which is very useful, but at the end of the day, it doesn't not explain the reasons why people use the term law to talk about what we today would call religion, which is a first open question which I address to you and also to the rest of the audience, because I have no answer. Anyway, to come back to your paper, I would rather talk in your case about the imposture of one religion, Christianity, and not in principle about the imposture of religions in the plural, because I mean, differently from other inquisitorial cases, it seems to me that in the very rich and intriguing documents that you found and put forward, we apparently do not find any trace of accusations against the two other religions of the book. But probably, correct me if I'm wrong, which is the decisive and necessary argument, in my opinion, to talk about the three impostors. There is, for instance, no mention of Moses, and Muhammad is mentioned. Because, for example, at the beginning of page 13, you say, I quote again, "The depiction of Muhammad as a lawgiver was the leitmotif of the theory of the imposture of religions," which is true. But in my opinion, it's a statement that can explain myself. Sorry, because Sorry, I'm receiving a call on my phone and probably it's disturbing the connection. I'm very sorry about that. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I was quoting your passage about Muhammad, which is one of the most important point of your paper, in my opinion. When you say on page 13, I don't know if you have the PDF, you can follow. The depiction of Muhammad as a lawgiver was the leitmotif of the theory of the imposture of religions. And I was saying that, I mean, this is true, but we have to pay attention to this point. Because as a matter of fact, given the equivalence between law and religion, which I mentioned before in the vocabulary of late medieval and early modern Europe, the term lawgiver, legislator in Latin, is to be interpreted not always in a political sense, I would say. Since law commonly, as I said, meant religion simply. So the very same term could also be used by people who did not want in any way to emphasize, I mean, the purely political nature of religions, devoid of any supernatural content. Like, for instance, a man who you mentioned several times in your paper, Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino, as well as other supporters of Prisca Theologia, they constantly talk about Moses and Muhammad, but also about Numa Pompilius, Osiris, Zoroaster, Lycurgus, Solon, and so on, as legislatores, but in the sense as founders of religions rather than, I mean, lawmakers or I don't know, political men. And they never dreamt of maintaining that they were impostors. So also in the same way, when you say, there's a passage that struck me and you repeated in your presentation, and you were right because it's very important. When Lodovico Garrano claims that the Holy Office forbade the books out of reason of state or something like that. Well, that passage, I do not think it's necessarily a reference to the imposture of religions, but probably I missed your point. Because, I mean, it seems to me that Lodovico Garrano is simply, okay, not simply, but is just denouncing that the church behaves with the logic of a state power, prohibiting books precisely so that one does not know the things that are contained in them. Okay, so my first request is to better specify the link between the theory of the imposture of religions and the two other angles of the triangle I constructed, but building on your own paper. The second and last point I'd like to discuss is the very process through which the idea that concupiscence is the major consequence of the fall somehow shifts from what you call on page 2, I think, middle rank and popular environments to the repertoire of learned radical thinkers, which invites us, I'm still quoting from your text, to reconsider established genealogies and periodization. I have to say that my heart is totally on your side. My mind needs this opinion to be better fleshed out, okay? In other words, although we all know how difficult it is to track the precise movement of an idea through different cultural levels, okay? But still, what I would like to hear from you is a more detailed picture of the rings of the transmission in this chain, which leads from people like Canatta and Garrano, which Garrano especially are not so middle rank, I would say. You mentioned his extraordinary library, okay? Cardano, Scaliger, Trithemius, Pietro d'Abano, this Virgil, which, I mean, we had a conversation about who is this Virgil, who is possibly the Latin poet, or Polydor Virgil, the author of The Inventors of Things, which, I mean, would be coherent with this sort of magical scientific collection of books that Garrano owns. But anyway, from this middle rank and popular environments, as you call them, to people like Le Motte-Levaillé and Beverland. So the top players of libertinage érudit. Of course, this would take a much wider space than just a paper, but I think it would be a very rewarding task. I do not have here, unfortunately, I forgot it in Pisa, the splendid book by Antonello Gerbi. Too bad also that there is no English translation of this book, differently from other books by Gerbi, which would be nice to have it sooner or later. But from what I recall, Gerbi does not really solve the problem of Beverland sources. The book of Gerbi starts from Beverland, and you made, I mean, a great job by reconstructing, I mean, the story behind Beverland. Okay, trying to show how the roots of this idea, I mean, sank in the early modern Mediterranean. At the end of page 1, you say, and you repeated it, and it's a very important point in your paper, that this heretical rereading of the Bible account of Genesis, as far as you are aware, had never appeared before. I would like to suggest you a possible way to address this problem, okay, in a very concrete fashion, inviting you to search a little bit more in the literature regarding the Questiones de Peccato Originali, which is to say the disputation around the problem of the original sin that were debated in medieval universities. We have this, just found these two useful bibliographical tips. The edition of Alexander of Hales by Wierbicki, published in 2012, and the 1984 book by Luciano Cova about Richard of Middleton. Of course, they were often silly discussions, okay? Sometimes just the occasion to discuss in utramque partem, as they say, so taking both sides of an argument. They were rhetorical exercises in most cases. But still, they often prove to be very important for other burning topics, okay? Like, for example, take the eternity of the word, for example, a topic on which I worked a little bit. With the problem of the eternity of the word, which was another, I mean, very burning question at the time, because, I mean, whatever you think about it, if the word was eternal from the beginning or until the end, I mean, either the creation or the final judgment, I mean, were bound to fall. So it was a very radical topic. When we take into account the problem of the eternity of the word, we see that it was debated by Parisian students of La Sorbonne. Then it was picked up by the peasants of Montaigu as well. And then again, it reemerged among the libertins érudits, among people like Beverland and Lemot-Levayer, if you want. I know it's difficult to carry on such a research in this present difficult condition, but I mean, already a check on the question of original sin in Aquinas' Summa Theologiae shows us that, I mean, the sexual nature of original sin due to unreproductive intercourse was, I mean, widely discussed, although obviously it was disapproved by Aquinas, but still it was a relatively easy idea to pick up for those who do not want to condemn it, of course, but to praise it, like your heretics. I just picked this short passage by the 82nd question of the first section of the second part of Summa Theologiae by Aquinas, De Peccato Originali, in which Aquinas basically says that man's concupiscible appetite is by nature under the rule of reason. Therefore, concupiscence is natural for man inasmuch as it is according to the order of reason. But when it passes such limits, it is against nature for man. And this is the concupiscence of original sin. So this could be another case, in my opinion, like, I mean, for tyrannicide or Christ's voluntary death, for instance, in which late 16th century and early 17th century radical thinkers, they sort of take their arguments from Aquinas and other Christian philosophers. They make fun of how unconsciously radical Aquinas and people like him actually were. And so this is also a way to suggest you a possible genealogy of the idea you are studying, because yeah, it seems to me very intriguing, but also very problematic that such an idea, I mean, pops up like sort of flying fish in the late 16th century Mediterranean. So I would like you to explore a little bit also the medieval background of this idea. And that's it. I'd really love to know your reaction, and I hope that my remarks help you to develop this really fascinating research you are into. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity of discussing it. And thank you all for the attention.
Do we want to give Umberto the opportunity to respond? Yeah,
I would like to, because I mean, there's a lot, and I think it might also be useful because a lot of question might be also the question that people had in mind, so we probably be. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. They're all kind of a substantial remarks, and I do appreciate it because it's always useful for me to talk. I mean, to Lucio, that's not the first time that we are sharing our ideas about this research, and it's always really kind of enlightening. I would like to start from the second point, the medieval sources. I mean, first of all, I'm not exploring the connection between like original sin and sexuality in general, but this particular manifestation is as far as I know. And fortunately here, the sources are quite like helpful. There's a medieval root. So let me just, no, I got to probably, there's probably a brief introduction about what I'm saying. I think that most of the question that you're posing comes from probably from a lack of clarity in the writing of the paper. So making clear what exactly I was doing through this paper, because I've already worked on like how the idea, kind of these ideas circulated, and more on the kind of a social background, and it's completely lacking from the paper, because what I've done in the last year, since all these guys were talking about books, was try to understand what were the books they were reading. But the paper is just about that. So it's right that it's not clear how these kind of readings and how the idea that they might have taken from the readings then interact with the circulation of idea and with their kind of everyday interaction. So I'm glad that you posing this problem, because it allowed me to give probably like a larger, bigger like picture to all the people who are here. And so as far as the original sin, they were actually talking, I mean, all the defendants, not all the defendants, most all the witnesses said that this discussion happened like with a book open. And there's also the frustrations, because some of the witnesses, which were not learned people and not able to read and not able to understand Latin, they couldn't understand what the guys were talking about. And here we go back also to one of the other major issues that you are asking, so which is kind of this cross like class, and how this cut across the social spectrum was not that this single individual were necessarily belonging to a cultural environment, to a like learned elite or popular environments. It's more that this discussion all happened like in public spaces, like grocery stores, apothecaries, or in a piazza, or in completely informal settings where people coming from different social backgrounds were involved and they contributed to the discussion. So there's this mention of this book that they were reading when they talk about, and they say, we don't know the title of the book and we don't understand what they were talking about. The source comes much later, like in a late 16th century case where was involved the director of a Jesuit school in Pavia, And when asked by the inquisitor, which is like these learned sources you are referring to, it refers to the jurist Claro. The jurist Claros, I read like the part that was referenced, was referring to Augustine, Sermones ad fratres inermos, which was not Augustine, but a pseudo-Augustine, who was widely circulating in the Middle Ages and was then prohibited because it contained a lot of very controversial statements, although apparently the kind of form, they were just like sermons dedicated to people living like in religious community. So it contained a lot also of sexual, and that it's a really kind of subtle passage in which is referring to the sodomitical scene. And he's saying, referring to the women, wasn't that enough for you to deceive the first man? So it's not saying that the first sin was sodomy, but in a context in which we're accusing women of like trying to seduce men to have anal intercourse, referencing to the original sin, that could have been interpreted that way. And so that's what they did, basically. Okay, so in terms of the circulation of idea, it's clear from the sources that it comes originally, this idea, from religious orders. So no one mentioned exactly which order, but so we all listened to, I mean, they were all exposed for the first time to this idea from, like, by talking with friars. We don't know, and then we are also an ongoing, like, recurrent episodes of people from the clergy, and that's are all preserved like in the archives of the Roman Inquisition, which are of course more interested, and also the power to prosecute priests. So there were also cases of people talking about that during the Mass, during the Sunday Mass, in the sermon, after the readings, during the Sunday Mass. So it was a thing like within, and for what I understood, it was basically an hookup device. So they used that when they wanted to have sex with someone. So they started the discussion of original sin using kind of this weird tale in order to, when you're asking me something about kind of this triangle, and I think it's easier to explain how it really happened, to my opinion, for what I can get from the sources, is that this idea was picked up in circles where people, in a very like informal and loose way, used to gather together to discuss about religion, relying upon sources who were clearly, strongly, unorthodox and heretical. And that this idea kind of got mixed up, this cluster of, radical ideas that are strongly reminiscent, and that's, I think, proven also by the kind of readings that they have, to the idea of impostural religion. I think one of the problems of the paper is not clear when I'm reconstructing the genesis of the idea of impostural religions, is because the authors they mention are related to that. And I think that some of the things that they picked up from these authors were related to the interpretation of these authors in the light of the impostural religion, because it's not the only way you can interpret Cardano. The reception of Cardano was a reception influenced by this kind of mindset, and they were receptive. So I'm not saying that they were taking the old theory, and talking about the three imposters. Some of them do that. Some of them not directly. Some of them are more kind of open and including, like in the discussion, Islam and Judaism. Others do not. They just apply the same idea of the imposture just to Jesus Christ, and that's the case of Marcello Impicciato, who, by the way, is the only one who claims of being like an illiterate. So it's much, I think, likely that he just picked up the things that were more related to his like direct experiences rather than seeing things from kind of a bigger perspective. So, and I think that there's also a problem that has to be like kind of fixed in the paper as written, the use of heresy. It's inappropriate. I realize that rereading is not what we're talking about. We're really talking about circulation of idea in a very loose way. We're very lucky because in the case of Marcello Impicciato, we have really a description of how the setting of the discussion, and I mean, they were gambling while talking about this stuff. and mentioning books and stuff, gambling, and sometimes they were drunk. And that was one of the problems with Impicciato, because he had some, I mean, he was kind of hated by his community because he was very aggressive and violent. But there were some good friends who were trying to protect him and saying, okay, when you have a drink too many, please don't talk about religion, you know, because you want to get in trouble. Yeah. So kind of the triangle, I think, is this idea. The origin is ecclesiastical circles. It's weird because when it emerges later on in kind of the learned libertine, the erudite, you know, libertine, it's referred to rabbinic sources, and that's a path that I have to explore, but I haven't started yet. But still, there's still the difference. I mean, are we talking about are we talking about kind of the genesis of the intellectual history, or how things were actually working in these cases? Because they refer to another learned source, which is not the one that the libertines are using to justify the. So this idea was circulating before, and it was kind of, the reception was different on the bottom line, I would say, and on the top line. So as far as the third kind of apex, I don't know, the third angle of the triangle, which is toleration and tolerance, that was my main kind of research interest when I started working on these cases. And I think that it really doesn't work as an interpretative like frame for these cases. And that's why I think that kind of the imposture side, although we're not talking about like the complete picture, but just the few things that those guys picked up from reading texts that were related to. Because I think when you're talking about tolerance, I think you got to do, I mean, I'm time for make things like easier for me. I kind of created kind of 3 like subgroups, and you mentioned the idea of prisca theologia, ancient religion. Then I think there's the idea of the boundless of the mercy of God, which is another stuff. And then there's the political idea of tolerance, which is completely content neutral, which is the post, late 16th, early 18th century, which is the one that still is relevant to our like political vocabulary. And I think it's very risky to project this kind of interpretative frame to the past because it doesn't. So to briefly say why I don't think none of these 3 really works is, I mean, prisca theologia is assuming that there's kind of an original revelation, and then there are like the revealed religion that comes after. So the real spiritual and the real like intellectual, they try to reconstructing what was before that. And to a different degree, they were saying basically there's like a common kind of core of truth in each religion. And then there were different ways to deal with the political consequences of that. So we can allow people to keep their own, religious rights because we know that deep inside they're saying the same things. So just try to play down as much as possible the difference. Or they may try to kind of not proselytize, but to kind of understand in the deepest way possible their knowledge of the original. But still it's strongly like, it's not content neutral. It's not whatever religion is the same. It's still the search of a truth that goes beyond religion. And that as well, if you talk about like the boundless mercy of God, which was very popular during the Reformation and as a reaction, of course, to the like outbreak of violence and religious like conflicts that shook Europe after, Luther, and we know what we're talking about. That too, it's not content neutral. You're assuming, I mean, God is so merciful and so imbued of love that is including everyone. So it depends on how much, and it could be God, Jesus Christ, or it could be like a more like neutral understanding of God, but still the frame is that the completely content neutral idea of tolerance, which is like the political tolerance, which no, I don't care what you are, what you believe, for the sake of the like preservation of the order within the community, we must allow a certain degree of religious freedom and not get into like polemics that are a waste of time and they may, jeopardize the political stability of our society. The only line that I draw is unless your religious ideas go against the peaceful, maintenance of the social order. I think that as well doesn't apply. First of all, because this kind of framework implies an ideal state that is absolutely not applicable to the experience that those people like in the late 16th, early 17th century, yeah, that's right, early 17th century were experiencing. And also because I don't believe that this form of skepticism is content neutral, because there's still the idea that by comparing the three religions, you're not making another claim that is content-based, but you are using skepticism as a methodical tool. You know what I mean? It's they might be all the same, so they might not be. So there's always kind of a bit of a transformative intent, which is not proselytism at all. That's not what I have in mind. But see that when I'm telling you this, I'm expecting you to question your own religious beliefs. So it's not tolerance. It's not tolerance as it's the post, British liberal, idea of tolerance. There's a philosophical and a methodical doubt that could be more or less internalized, depending on the degree of consciousness of the people I'm talking about, because I told you they didn't belong to the same, social environment. But still, I think that there was the will to provoke a reaction, and it could be either for their own self-fashioning. I mean, I want to stand out as someone who is in the know, so I understood better than you what religion is all about. But still, there was always a kind of idea of it's a philosophical tool, skepticism here. So it's not content neutral. So that's why I think that probably the third part of the triangle, I would keep it. I mean, of course, I will say that in the book, in a chapter, but I think it doesn't really explain what was going on, which I think it was a very loose and informal reception of ideas that were historically associated to the history of the imposture of religion. And that I'm not saying, and I think there's a linguistic problem in the way in which I written. When I'm reconstructing the genealogy of the intellectual, that's for sake of clarity, of the imposture of religion, but I'm not saying that my heretics, are an actual chain in the transmission. And I think that there are some ambiguities and so I'm glad that you noticed that, because you allowed me to kind of rethink what I wrote and kind of clarify this point.
In a sense, they're kind of the obverse of the Prisca Theologica tradition. It occurred to me that, you're not saying that tradition leads to tolerance, but if we say that it sort of ends in figures like Lessing and Nathan the Wise, there really is a tolerance there.
No.
Because the differences between the religion Lessing and other 18th century intellectuals, philosophers are saying, is because you cherish the differences, not only the underlying truths, but you cherish the differences between the religions because each of them offers something. But we need to move on, but I want to second Lucia's observation that perhaps getting back to the scholastics is where you need to go, because sodomy, as you know, is a huge field. It's not just anal sex. It's fellatio, it's cunnilingus, it's dildos. There's all kinds of practices that fall under that rubric. I remember years ago when Judy Brown's book on the lesbian nun in Renaissance Italy appeared, and she had contended that lesbianism was really incomprehensible to people in the Middle Ages. And I said this to somebody, and they pulled off a volume of the Summa Theologia off their bookshelves and read me 10 or 12 just passages about female attraction. There was no sexual practice that
There was not
not
already.
comprehended and discussed by people in the Middle Ages. They pored over everything. And then before we moved on to Jean-Pierre Cavalier, the other thing I just wanted to point out is that I think that use of the term philosophical naturalism perhaps should be avoided. It's really one that in English is almost meaningless.
Okay.
So, but I know that Jean-Pierre wanted to make some observations before we opened it up, and then we have Bernie Cooperman as the first of people who want to ask a question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So thank you. Do you mind if I briefly introduce you?
No.
As a special guest to these.
I prepared something.
Yeah, because I invited
Okay.
Jean-Pierre. Oh, no,
Thank you.
sorry. Okay, I just invited Jean-Pierre to join, and then I mean he's working on these topics since a really long time, and he told me that he's got really some interesting pieces of information related to this specific research. So I thought it was just probably nice having him have a bit more than just a question. So I really thank you for being here. Jean-Pierre Cavalier is maître de conférence à l'École des hautes études en sciences sociales. If I'm not, is that the right qualification? And then, yeah, I'm glad to pass. So you can go now. Thank you very much. I appreciate.
Thank you. And above all, thank you for your paper. Your paper is very interesting, and the case is presented in your paper. Really, for me, above all, more stones, more bricks in order to for the reconstruction of an European early modern underground culture of radical criticism of Christianity, and not only, in fact, of all established revealed religions. And above all, it seems to me that this case and much other demonstrates that this culture, underground cultures, crosses all social classes. It's a very important datum for me. And I hope, Umberto, that you will soon publish also the inquisitorial documents of these cases. It would be very important for us also too. So now, yes, I would only like to quote another document which attests the diffusion of the specific topic, it's specific, yes, of heterosexual buggery, sodomy, ironically identified with original sin. It's another text of sort of pornographic literary entertainment by the French libertine Lamotte Levaillet. Umberto talked already about him, but it's another. It's not the Hexameron rustique. It's another text, but we can find within the Hexameron rustique the same things more or less. It's an allegorical interpretation of some verses of Homer, which the title is L'Antre des Nymphes, the cave of the nymphs. And I published this text some years ago. And it's a very transgressive text. Only manuscript, and it was the first publication. And in this text, there is a long digression about the Venus postica, with, among other things, for me, it's very important, quotations of Italian proverbs about heterosexual buggery, popular proverbs. It's very interesting for me because it reveals, in my opinion, the importance of the diffusion of this topic in contemporary oral culture, with accounts about prophylactic and contraceptive uses of contemporary heterosexual sodomy in the early modern period. For example, I can't translate, it's impossible, but it's possible. The proverb, quando in casa è il marchese, il culo fa le spese.
That's untranslatable. I mean, it's embarrassing, and there's a rhyme, so I don't know how to translate it with a rhyme.
But it demonstrates the great diffusion of the this culture of popular practice of sodomy in order to with prophylactic and contraceptives reasons. And okay, but suddenly in this text of La Motte Levaillet, we find the words, I translate in English, we must make fun of the interpretation of some rabbis. You talk about this idea, which rabbis I don't know, who wanted that the apple of which our first father was tempted was the figure of the back parts of his wife, which very well represents an apple cut in half. The prohibited fruit would therefore have been the back part of Eve, with a very imprecise rabbinic reference. Levaillet tells more or less the same thing in his Examen rustique with a chapter dedicated to the same allegory. And it's a book, this Examen rustique, which he managed to publish at the venerable age of 80. It's very interesting also. One can say that it's only a literary joke, a carnival exercise, as Levaillet himself says. And in fact, we know that the back parts as apple linked to sodomy. It's a very common motive within the burlesque literature of Berni and so-called Berneschi poets. There is a lot of examples in the huge thesis of Jean Toscan, le Carnaval du langage, the Carnival of Language. You know, Umberto's this incredible thesis. More generally, I think we can speak of a close link, in effect, between the early modern underground culture of burglary, homo and heterosexual, perhaps above all heterosexual, and in fact, the naturalist and political criticism of religions, revealed religions. With this specific topic of practice of sodomy as an heavenly practice, now prohibited, but in fact reserved for a happy few, princes, philosophers, popes, and monks. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I not to be so long, too long.
I had meetings all this morning, but Judy Hallett, who is here, sent me a poem from the Ithyphallic Priapus, 1st century CE. I've just sent it to you, Umberto,
Thank you.
which was also exploited, she believes, by Renaissance humanists, which provides another line of lineage which suggests that the a connection between the fruit and the apple and the buttocks. You could take a look at it, but maybe Judy wants to comment before we move on to Bernie.
Mute myself. Yeah, first of all, let me just say hi to Jonas Lillikvist, who hosted me in Umeå 4 years ago. It's great to see him again. Yeah, this is a poem from the 1st century CE. I won't read the Latin. I'll just translate it for you. The god Priapus in his garden is speaking. He says, "It's right for me to say to you whatever it is in a forthright manner, since my nature," by which he means his erect male organ, "is always open. I want to butt fuck you," and it can be either male or female figure, and you want to pluck apples. This is interesting. It's connection with apples and fruits in a garden. "If you will have given what I seek, you will receive what you seek." And I'm just wondering about the genesis of all of this in a pagan Roman literary tradition that has trickled down, as it were, completely separate from any religious tradition, through Renaissance humanism. And there are a lot of other poems in this particular a collection about sodomy and gardens and fruit, and I'm happy to send you some others.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, there's like there are a lot of, like, they use like a fruits as metaphors, as symbols of like parts of the body. It's pretty common, like in 15th, 16th century, like burlesque and erotic poetry. But of course, if I mean, being able also to reconstruct more like long-term, genesis of these kind of tropes, and that would be really great. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think there's another strand that you want to figure into all of this.
Yeah.
Bernie, do you want to go ahead?
Bernie, yeah.
We can hear you. Okay.
There, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I can.
Thank you all, Umberto especially, but thank you all for stimulating paper. I want to maybe pick up some of the themes that have already been mentioned by Lucio and Jean-Pierre, and open up sort of the way you do it. In the paper, not so much in the discussion, but in the paper, you tend to distinguish between popular culture and literary culture, and you talk about whether ideas could have come from the Toldot Yeshu, because you have an illiterate who couldn't have had the Latin version of the Jewish satirical version of the Gospels and things like that. But it seems to me that already you've laid out the possibility that culture is not nearly as distinguished or as leveled and as separate from each other. So how ideas pass around and what people know is more complicated. So to build on that, it seems to me, the paper and the investigation is built around specifically the issue of buggery and a particular sexual act. In Jewish religious rhetoric, at least back to the 12th century, with the rise of Kabbalah, eroticism is the powerful image and the powerful metaphor that is constantly being used in one way or another to talk about the relationship between God and man, the experience of the spiritual. You talk about the flowing of waters like fountains and so forth and so on. It's erotic images, both ostensibly or both implicitly erotic and literally erotic is everywhere. So my question is in two parts. First of all, in terms of what you're presenting, is it necessary to think of, is there any basis for not looking at this particular act and the heretical approach? Is there not a discussion within Christianity, possibly linked to what's going on in the Jewish world, or vice versa, that the Jewish world is picking it up from Christian rhetoric, a discussion of eroticism itself as a form of spirituality, a form of experience, and so forth and so on? And the second thing that I would just throw in here is that Jews, of course, without being heretical in the traditional sense, are the deviant group within Christian society. And they have a totally different, I've never come across in a rabbinic source what Professor Cavalier was talking about, a rabbinic source, but they are the source of, or they are an official, illegitimate a set of interpretations of the Bible, and they reject completely the notion of original sin as having led to they have a different fruit. They don't think it's an apple, they think it's a fig, and they have different understandings of what the entire original sin was, and also that there was such a thing as original sin that damned mankind forever, and that therefore Jesus had to come and atone for, because they reject all of these ideas, and they have a lot of discussions of the things. So
thank you very much. I think, as far as looking at the wider discussion about, the role of eroticism in spirituality, I think that there's a lot that could be said in the Christian tradition too. There's of course the idea of kind of erotic mysticism has played a role, and it's largely testified by spiritual texts since the Middle Ages. What I would point out is that these cases are kind of time bounded to a specific time frame, which is after the Council of Trent, where there was after some started during the Council of Trent, where there's huge effort in trying to control and also sanitize, I would say, this aspect of Christian spirituality from, these kind of erotic leanings. And there's a huge control, and it's very hard to, at the moment, I think there was an idea to control both images and also the description of mystical experiences themselves. And there's a lot of cases, for example, of women talking about their union to God, a union with Christ, in terms that are really reminiscent of sexual intercourse. And they were also, subject to a very strict control. And I'm not saying that they were not allowed to, as some of them, they were also being kind of included in the canon of the doctors of the church, like Teresa d'Avila, but still they were kept under control, and it was, they have to, prove that they were really, really respectful, of the other dogmas, the major tenets of the Catholic Church. So it was allowed, but very controlled, this kind of expression. So I would say that that's probably the reason, because sexual heresies become so relevant, and also have in the context of Western Christianity, they are so philosophically and theologically charged, because there wasn't enough space probably for these kind of feeling. For an aspect, it was kind of like part of the human, I don't know, experience to find expression in a way that was compatible with spiritual research, with the spiritual, you know, search and the quest for the union of God. And I think that another side aspect would be, from a strictly like Christian perspective, is the erotization of like people belonging to other religions, with a projection that elsewhere there was more sexual freedom. And that's something that I see, that's something that is part of also of the cases I'm working on. Some of them, I mean, they were in Sicily, so they were very close, and they have constant experiences of, you know, people, you know, keeping slaves and stuff. And more than one people, I wouldn't say a lot, say, I wish I would, you know, kept as a slave by the Muslims, because they having like a much better life, they're enjoying more life, they're having more like sexual freedom down there. As far as the rabbinic literature is kind of involved in these cases, I don't have any, you know, evidence that push me like into this direction. So since it's already a very like complicated issue, I mean, I'm already dealing, I think, with a fairly like controversial and complicated material. It's not easy to deal with that and to kind of have it like a proper like understanding how to manage this stuff. I would avoid to add too many irons in the fire. So there would probably like an introduction in which I mentioned the existence of a larger, you know, like Mediterranean. But as far as sexuality is concerned, I will probably limit myself. I will focus myself more on like Christianity and Islam, and will probably keep, also because I really don't think, I mean, for what I've read of, for example, of the Toledo Tiejo, I mean, the version that could have been like available to these guys are not reminiscent at all of the kind of statements they're making. While, for example, I don't know, Celsus was one of the sources probably of the Toledo Tiejo, it really resonates much more. I mean, of course, it's not, I mean, you don't have evidences, but at least if you're thinking that there's something you should go to look at, I think it's more like in this direction rather than, but I do appreciate, yeah, I think that there's an enormous like potential also in exploring this part of the.
Gary, you said your question or your comment was just very brief. I know you would pass the baton to Sonia, but maybe you want to get it in before you leave.
Okay, it's just very quick. I mean, one of the many things that's intrigued me with Umberto's work here is the southern Italy and the Dutch parallels, connections. So Umberto, and you and I can have a conversation by email on this, but perhaps Faustus Socinus, have you looked at him? What does he say about original sin? Because the Socinians were very big in the Netherlands in the 17th century. We've got Dutch heretics like the David Joris, who's got a lot of sexual stuff in his heresy that, and an unusual interpretation of original sin. But also the other parallel that you highlight for Italy, of course, is the close interconnections of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And in the 17th century, that also became the case in the Dutch Republic. So just things to think about, but you and I can certainly talk more.
Okay.
Thanks, Gary. Sonia.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is way outside my realm of expertise. I'm a modern women's historian, but the sexuality angle, of course, is very interesting to me. And so my question is, I mean, if you think of this as kind of a chapter in the long history of sexuality and sexual prohibitions, what is it specifically that they object to? Why do they object to sodomy? What is it about, or anal intercourse? Let's be more specific. Is it because, and I think Lucio and Jean-Paul also touched on this a little bit, is it because it's unreproductive? Do they know, what is known at this point about contraception, the physiology, kind of history of medicine? What is known about conception? do they think that anal intercourse would avoid conception? Is it a form of, if you will, of birth control? So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
So thank you very much. I mean, I think, yeah, there was an awareness that there was no way to get pregnant by having like anal intercourse, unless in some very like weird description about monstrous like generations. So sometimes it was given as an explanation of the genesis of some monstrous creature. But what I would say that the main, like what they were trying to like question, yeah, was basically the idea of applying the law of nature to sexuality in a way that restricted what was natural just to reproduction. And I'm really glad that you are mentioning medicine, because I think it's really important to point out the extent to which, when you look to other forms of discourses that were not theological, there were much more like possibilities left open to like experimentation and there was more kind of a curiosity understanding how things work. So even though like in a Christian like framework, it was not possible to talk about medicine saying that sodomy was a viable possibility and also useful in some circumstances, though there were similar opinion coming from the classical medical tradition that were fairly discussed. And Pietro d'Abano was one of them, for example, which is one of the sources of my heretics. And what I would like to point out, and I think this is kind of a crucial point that I haven't done yet, like I haven't done that in the paper, is that when you look at these sources of explanation of basically the world that don't rely on religion, but are more in line with a scientific explanation, although when we use scientific, we have to understand what was meant to be scientific at the time. So what was like the paradigm of medicine, but also like astrology and medicine were strictly connected. What I think it's important and point out the extent to which the cultural background, when you look at these alternative explanations that are not religious, in the Mediterranean world, it's really a shared background between the three main, between the Muslim, the Christian, and the Jewish culture, because they basically exegesis and reinterpretation of a set of basic texts that are that come from like the Greek or Latin, but mostly Greek tradition. And I think this is a really important like point to be made that goes back also to what like Gary was saying before about this kind of coexistence of the religion, of like religious tradition, and also what was saying. I think that working on these cases allows us to rethink the kind of frame of cross-cultural, which is, I think it's really strongly influenced by confessional history and the post-Reformation history, and is applied to like the relationship between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. While when we move to these kind of undercurrent of natural explanations of like natural phenomena, but also as Lucio was mentioning, the origin of the world. So the world was eternal, was that created. We see that that it's really possible, I think, to talk about like a common and a shared set of ideas that they were developing a constant like dialogue between the three like cultural kind of tradition. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Are there other questions?
I see Tom Kaiser has his hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Okay, Tom.
You need to unmute yourself, Tom. There you go. No, you're muted now.
I'm muted.
No, now again.
You're muted again. You muted yourself.
There
Okay.
we go.
That work?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. I'm just wondering, in any of this literature, if there are any references to New World practices, for example. Because obviously the discovery of the New World and the further exploration of the Far East had a huge influence on the debate about religion and what is natural to religion and what is Christianity and a whole range of different questions. It also bore on the whole issue of atheism and what atheism was in this period. And I think your paper, which sort of discusses skepticism, moves to a certain extent in that direction. But I guess my specific question would be, are there references to New World practices that in any way inflect this sort of debate and discussion?
Yeah, there are really a lot. I mean, there's a, and I would say it's a completely different, like, it opens up. I mean, what I want to say, I think that there's nothing that is really specific to the research that I'm doing now. It's something I already dealt with, like in previous researches, and a huge amount of literature. I would say probably the only, the safest, given, I mean, the time, I would say probably the safest thing to do, if I can like follow up an email and send you some second, because nothing I've worked on like primary sources, secondary bibliography, and I just send you some of like the reference book on the topic, because I mean, sexuality, not just sexuality, I mean, the problem of original sin and the problem of the new world, they're strictly connected, reflection about, I mean, because you just having people who haven't been exposed to the, you know, the kind of Abrahamic religion. What's the role of those people? Do they belong to the same, you know, to the same breed? Are there different origins of the human beings in different places? I mean, it's a huge, and there are also a lot of kind of interconnection with discourses on sexualities that are very like deep and meaningful, but that would be really, that would be go beyond my expertise and beyond like my object of research and my specific subject of research now, and it would be just too long. So I'm glad to forward you if you can. Yeah, I can find your email.
That would be interesting.
References, yeah. I mean, just people who can talk about that in a much better, you know, than I could do now, just in a few minutes. Yeah.
Just to specifically the question of whether, let's say, sodomy is natural.
Sodomy is natural.
And
Yeah.
could there not be reference? There, you might find reference in some of the travel literature. I don't know. I'm speaking from ignorance, but
no, it was usually used as a justification. You see, they're doing like unnatural practices. Therefore, there was a legitimation for the Western occupation and exploitment because they could exploitation. So they could say, okay, they don't follow the law. I mean, there was a huge debate because there were people who were not. Okay, whether the infraction of, you know, natural law could have been used or not as a justification for the occupation and the native population in the New World. So there's a lot about that. In terms of natural, I would say that's, you know, very kind of without referencing any, you know, specific, like in general, the application of an ethnographic model in the observation of the sexuality of native people favor the introduction of the idea that people practicing sodomy belonged to a different species within the Christian society. That's really, I mean, I'm really simplifying a thing that it's really like much more complex, but that's like one of the perspectives through which people have interpreted. So how much having like an ethnographic approach to sexuality helped kind of merging the medical perspective and the ethnographic perspective and thinking about sexual species rather than sexual acts. So something that's kind of the biggest.
That would be interesting, yeah.
Yeah, that's, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Stefano, yeah, go ahead.
Stefano wants to.
I had the chance to talk with Umberto at length about his paper. The comment, and so we have already started this conversation. But in a way, I really appreciate the comments by Cavalier, because in a way, from my point of view, they are addressing a major question that in your paper, in a way, I think you didn't emphasize enough. That is the fact that sometimes we shouldn't look for a literary, philosophical, or religious source, but we have to trust the creativity, even of lower class people. And I mean, I remember that there was a huge discussion among the historians of witchcraft after about the argument by Carlo Ginzburg in the Sabbath and so on. And a lot of historians were emphasizing the idea of the natural mechanism of inversion that plays a role in the construction of the Sabbath by the inquisitors. So in a way, I think that to look at the Proverbs, the popular Proverbs, makes sense, because I mean, you can really think about all this emphasis by catechism and so on about original sin, the idea that this original sin is linked to sexuality. And so for the natural process of inversion, you go the other way around in a way. So from a methodological point of view, this is one of the things that I already discussed with Umberto. I have the feeling that sometimes you have the inquisitorial attitude, that you are building up an heresy that doesn't exist if not in the eyes of the inquisitor, that is placing things together, pieces of a puzzle, but the puzzle is only in the mind of the inquisitor.
Okay, no, thank you very much. We already had a chance to discuss by that. I mean, I think that's weird because that's not what the inquisitors are doing, because there's not like, they never refer to these clusters of idea as an heresy. I do agree with you, but reading the paper that I've kind of unconsciously done that. That's why this is something, I mean, also, I mean, the majority of the remarks that came from like Lucio also comments, they're related to this kind of ambiguity in the way in which I think it really needs kind of a rephrasing, like probably different like word choices. But I don't agree completely with what you're saying, because I cannot, it would be, I mean, books were relevant to them. So they were talking about books. They were reading books and they were using books to diminish their own acquaintances, say, what are you saying? Shut up, you're just an ignorant. These are the kind of answers that allegedly from the witnesses they gave to people who were trying to kind of question what they were saying. So I would say, as an historian, if I would not just overlook this part, that would be a huge missing part of the picture, and it needs to be dealt with. As I've already said at the beginning of the paper, at the beginning of in my like responses to Lucio, I think it's clear that it needs to be also integrated more in the like giving more idea of the social background and how these ideas circulated. I think that what has to be completely erased from the paper are two terms. Because I think that are the two terms that create much problems, which is reception and transmission. I think that this implies the idea of a sect, you know, of beliefs that is established and that was circulating, and there was someone who was willing to have, to kind of proselytize, or having someone joining their own. That was not what was going on. And I realized, I realized after you have told me for the first time this kind of impression, I realized that I had internalized the perspective of the inquisitor without being completely, you know, aware that I was doing that. And that's something that it just happens with. That said, the paper that I circulated is just one part, and I would say is the part I have more like difficulties to deal with, and that's why I wanted to have a discussion about this stuff, because I think about like using inquisitorial sources for reconstructed social history, something I'm enough trained and I know how to manage this. How to manage the interaction, it's more complicated, and I think that this discussion has been really useful for me, really useful, so I'm really very glad to be all of you. That said, I think that it's something in between what you were saying and what I'm saying, and I just make clear jokes and proverbs are relevant. They were integrated and discussed along with books and mother that also came from, and that's why the joke became something in which there was kind of a step forward in understanding what was its meaning, because it was discussed along with other kinds. So you cannot, I think you cannot overlook the fact that, I mean, they smuggle books. I mean, Garrano smuggled books from Venice. He had like boxes of books arriving with books, you know, and also about like the circulation of ideas. There are, if you follow like the movements of these people, you see that the first case that is prosecuted in Naples is a Sicilian guy who was prosecuted in Sicily too, and that was the first case in Naples. Then you have Garrano, who travels constantly from Naples to Sicily. Then you have the relation of the books that are smuggled, and there are these. So what I'm saying, it's not that there was like a formal heresy that was being transmitted, but simply that just like-minded people, they travel and they look other like-minded people to whom have, you know, discussion about the fact and the books they were passionate about. And in this way, the ideas were kind of circulated and transmitted, but it was not just about popular culture, because I do believe with Bernie that there's really no way to make a clear-cut distinction between popular culture and learned elite. That's true for astrology. I mean, elites relied on astrology to make their political decision, and they paid astrologers. So not even the fact that these guys were tricksters sometimes, just trying to, you know, get money from the neighbors and acquaintances, make them that difference from, you know, a Cardano who was asking money for, you know, doing the janitors to, I don't know, a noble somewhere in Europe. And at the same time, I mean, also the distinction between like oral and printed culture, I think it's really hard to make for this time, because we see how much like reading was not just like a private, because I think it's a bit like in a post-19th century, the idea that you are in your home reading your own book, while we see there how much there was like also a collective experience of reading. And I would say, I mean, is a university lecture oral culture or written culture? How books were conceived? I mean, we're talking about my book now. So my book is going to be, you know, it's going to be right down at a certain point, but without a previous discussion. And all these popular elements just got into the picture in these kind of very lively environments where very kind of passionate discussion could happen, putting together people coming from different backgrounds. So books are not everything. I mean, it's not that you have to reconstruct each phrase and each sentence that is reported in an inquisitorial trial, trying to see what could be the source, but still it cannot be overlooked like in a bigger picture. So that's my answer to your. Yeah.
Okay, anything else? Well, I want to thank Umberto and Lucio and Jean-Pierre for their comments, and Umberto especially for this very, I was going to say fertile, but maybe that's not the right word, or fecund, but stimulating paper. And they're all bad choices, Bernie. I see you in your head. So, Karen, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think we'll just bring this to a close and thank everyone for joining us, and for our commentators and Umberto, not just for the talk, but for the time you've spent with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.